Hi there, this is John Felix, or the Battle Right Profiler, with a brand new little series called Breaking Down. And in these videos I will have one guest and we will talk about one topic only. So the point of this is to be able to go deep about a subject with someone who's like an expert in said subject. So for the first one, I wanted to talk about the bans that will be coming in for season 2. This is something that has been received well by a lot of people. Some people are skeptical, and a lot of people have waited for it a long time. And with me for this we have Boccato. Welcome.
What is up? How is it going, guys? Pleased to be here.
If someone doesn't know you and why you are the perfect person to talk to about bans, could you give a short introduction of yourself?
Sure. My name is Gabriel. People know me by my middle name and my nickname, which is Boccato. And I am the eSports coordinator for Stunlock Studios, and obviously one of the people in charge for deciding bans for Season 2 in Battle Royale Pro League.
All right.
Yeah.
I remember talking to you on a Discord call during season 1. It was the first time I talked to you. And back then already, we talked about the potential implementation of bans. I don't think you had decided on it, but we were talking about bans at least. When did you first consider having bans in the BPL?
To be honest, it was already considered for Season 1. We were thinking about it, but it was sort of like a topic that we always wanted to see how a pro league would work without bans first. But from the very start, we considered for Season 1. At the end of the day, I think it was a good move to not have it on Season 1 because we got to see a lot of things, right? What went right, what went wrong. And now we got to compare in Season 2 what will go right and wrong with bans as well. But it was considered on Season 1 from the very start, yeah.
All right. Was there anything about how Battle Right is as a game that made you say that, no, I don't think we should have bans yet?
Right, so first I'm going to say a very, I don't know, curious thing. When I had my first tournament ever in Battle Royale, and that was literally 1 week after we launched early access, I did a tournament with 2 bans per team. And back then, like, people bashed me a lot. Like, everyone hated because no one used it. People came from BLC and they hated the idea of bans. So overall, it was super poorly accepted. But from the very start, I always saw potential in bans for Battle Royale. And I think Battle Royale, like the game Battle Royale, is something that will possibly, I say, deal with bans very well. The reason why I think that is basically because I think we will be talking more about this during the interview, but to the very context of bans, I think that it will allow for more individual skill rather than team-based compositions, essentially.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, that's a very interesting point. Why? Let's dive into that right away. Why do you think that is? That it will change?
All right, so I'm not sure how many people realize this, but when teams practice for tournaments, they practice comps. So they literally decide a composition that they are comfortable with, and they hammer that composition over and over and over. Obviously, it doesn't mean that teams will train only a single composition, but they will train like 3 compositions or two compositions, or sometimes even just one. So with bans, what that means is it will be very, very rare a situation where you get to use the composition that you want. And what that means, from my perspective, I guess, is that essentially it will boil down more to specific individual skill rather than if a team can coordinate or do things well. Obviously, this will always be a factor, but I just think that it will be reduced a little bit and it will give more opportunity for individual skill to shine. That's the way I see it, at least.
All right. I'm sure we'll return more to that later in the interview. But I was curious now because I know that a lot of players, pro players in the BPL, have actually called for bans being implemented in the BPL, and we saw a big change now for season 2. I mean season 3 in just the game overall is that you will remove 2v2 from ranked. And
Yeah.
I also heard from players that this is something that we really pushed for when we were at the Stunlock Studio office giving feedback. So I get the sense that the pro player feedback is something that you value a lot in your decisions. How big part of the player request was
All right.
the reason for you
So
implementing bans?
just I guess one just for clarity and context is that I don't decide in terms of 2v2, 3v3.
No, I
But
understand that.
yeah, but just for clarity, I
Yeah.
guess. And in terms of BPL, so here's how I see player feedback. A lot of the times, I think players are very, very good in pointing out problems. I don't necessarily agree with the reasoning. So, for example, there was I think a lot of players defined bans as a way to avoid what they call like rock, paper, scissors, right? Which is comp A beats B beats C beats A. I think this won't go away with bans. I think counter compositions will always happen, and it's part of competitive game. It's part of like strengths and weaknesses within every champion. I honestly don't think if they believe this is the case, bans won't do pretty much anything. Uh, but the way I see it and what they requested from the start was they wanted to have more weight, so to speak, in the game's outcome, which is essentially how I translated this feedback was what I just told you, which is they want their individual skill to be more a bigger factor than what composition they're running.
Mm-hmm.
So, like I said, I don't necessarily agree with the reasoning of like it's rock paper scissors because I just think bands won't change that if they feel that. But I do understand the fact that they, as an individual, want to have more weight in the outcome of their games. So that's how I see it. Like the feedback was really good. I just don't necessarily completely agree with the reasoning. So at the end of the day, it was super useful. The feedback. It was just not a blind decision like, oh, players want bans, so let's do bans. You know.
All right. Um, I was thinking now, before we go further, if anyone hasn't read the explanation of how things will work, I thought maybe we could just go through how the draft phase will work now that we have a ban phase going forward.
All right. So essentially, it's just imagine the in-game draft system with when you're playing ranked, but you add a ban before any champion is picked and before the third champion. And it works exactly the same way, which is like you decide your ban. Once your opponent decides their ban, it will be revealed for both teams. And it's also worth noting that the ban will only affect the opponent team. So if I ban Shifu, your team, I'm sorry, my team can still pick Shifu. unless obviously if you ban Shifu. So that's how it will work for season 2 at least.
All right, and then there are two bans, right? There are two bans.
2 bans per team, yeah.
And the second ban is not at the start of the draft, right?
Correct. It's before the 3rd pick.
Right. So it's ban, pick, pick, ban, pick. That's the order
exactly.
which you do.
Exactly.
This. Okay. Yeah. So what's the reason? And this is something that you mentioned in the talk that I mentioned earlier. We were talking about bans. I remember you mentioning that already. That was something that you thought about. Why did you decide to go with that way of banning, that you have one in the start and one ban later on?
All right, so there are a few reasons for that. I would say the first, which was also, by the way, player feedback, is that players said that they wanted to avoid situations as, for example, the Rook Iva older composition, right?
Yeah.
If we only had one ban, I don't think this would necessarily do much. People would ban Rook, and then they would just pick whatever is best under Rook. But it would keep Iva older and this so-called tier 2 Rook. So for one, I honestly think one ban wouldn't do pretty much anything besides teams running like the second to best composition, or just eliminating the so-called one-trick players. And that's really not the point of bans, as I mentioned. And the second thing to do that is, since the ban will only be affecting the opponent team, if the bans would only affect, like it would affect both teams, what would happen is that there would be turns to do bans.
Yeah. So
like your team bans Rook, neither teams can use Rook, and then my turn, and then I ban Iva or whatever.
Yeah.
But what that implies is that maybe first ban is OP, so to speak, and it's too good in terms of strategy. Or maybe the second ban is too good. So I want it to be affecting only the other team, because this way it's fair, like the picks, and also I think it allows for more diversity at the end of the day, to people to ban what your opponent is using and not necessarily banning yourself.
Yeah. I remember the first time you told me, I was a bit skeptical, because watching other games, I think it's more common to see that when you ban something, you ban it for yourself as well. But after thinking about it, I realized that it works very well with the way you're doing picks now, that both team pick and then they're revealed at the same time. Like you said, that would be hard to do if we were going the other way. Like then you would have to, I make a ban and then I show you what I've banned, because you won't be able to ban the same thing, right? So yeah. I think it also feels consistent with the way you're picking champions.
And I'm not a super fan of comparing bans within games, but for example, Hearthstone do bans, and you only ban the class for your opponent.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't think there's a rule, so to speak, like bans should always apply for both sides or whatever. I think we need to figure out how the game is played. And for example, in Battle Right, we accept champions to be in both teams, right?
Yeah, mirror matches.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And League of Legends doesn't have that.
No.
Or the style of the game, or what do you want with bans? So I don't know. I don't think it's necessarily a rule that bans should always be like this or like that. You know, I think you need to understand the game, understand the reasoning, and create the style that is optimal to it.
I was also curious about map bans. Will we still have map bans like we had before?
Yeah, map bans continue the same. basically teams alternate until the amount of maps they need. So in a best of 3, they will ban until there's 3 maps left, for example.
And do you do this? Do they do this before you start the ban and pick phase of your champions?
Exactly. You ban maps, and then you select what map you're playing, and then you do a champion draft. And then if it's a best of 3, for example, every map it's decided, you have a new champion draft.
Okay. So let's see. I've seen regular players in just the community discussing bans be a bit skeptical about bans and afraid that it will go from being in just the BPL to being implemented in the actual game later on as well. Is that something that you think is considered? Like, is this a testing ground for bans for the actual game?
Like a very clear-cut answer is we're definitely not, have not considered anything in terms of in-game or ranked or league or custom or whatever. It's something strictly for BPL. Obviously, if the community sees this as something they enjoy and like do some sort of community feedback that they want this to be later improved in ranked system, I don't see why not. But it's not something that we're testing or we're having in mind or anything like that. So if you don't like bans, don't worry. And by the way, if you don't like bans, as a viewer, I think you should always express yourself, because I think it's a new thing, right? So we're always listening to community feedback as well.
Yeah. I've seen a lot of community feedback about bans, and a lot of it concerns like you said, one tricking. Like people who are one tricks, players who are one tricks, they will just be banned out, and also that this will stop players from being able to play their main champion or their best champion. Personally, I think that this is completely untrue. I don't think bans will have that effect. Do you think there's any risk for that?
Okay, so there's 2 things. So one, for one tricks, I honestly consider this one of the small downsides of bans, because I don't think one trick is in itself a bad thing, but bans honestly do punish them. So I honestly consider that one of the bad things about bans. But making people not playing their mains, I don't think it's honestly a thing. Because for example, and I saw this in people mentioning, verse with Jumong and Taya. But in the grand finals for DreamHack, he played Iva.
Yeah.
And he didn't play it because it was his main champion or signature champion or whatever. He played it because he felt it was optimal competitive-wise. And at the end of the day, the more competitive the scene gets, people will funnel to those situations where it doesn't matter if I like A, B, or C. I'm playing D because it's working right now.
Yeah. I mean, that's always been my response to that criticism, that people say, I want to see people be able to play their best champion, so I don't want bans. And then I think back to Season 1 playoffs, where every team only played Rook, Older, Iva. And I think Fable eSports and NA are the only team that mained those 3 champions. Like, they were lucky there, because thus were the 3 mains of those players, before the rest of the players in both EU and NA, like, this was not the main champions that they played. They had to play it because it was the strongest comp.
Yeah, and I don't think I don't think even players that have their mains mention that, to be honest, at least to me. When we discussed bans, no one expressed this sentiment that, oh, I want to be able to play my main. they didn't, because they already didn't play in previous season without bans, as you mentioned.
And I think most, not all, but most pro players will say that Battle Right is a comp-based game. So I think they're just thinking about this thing in the terms of compositions, like you said. When they practice, they don't practice, I'm going to practice this certain champion because if I get good at this one champion, we win. They practice compositions, right? 3 champs that work well together.
Exactly.
So I think,
and no, go ahead.
Yeah, so just to follow up on that point about people being skeptical, I think the thing that they want when they say that they think bans is a bad idea, I think they'll get more of what they want thanks to bans as viewers than they did without the bans, actually.
Exactly. That was exactly what I was going to point out. Like, if you have less of I'm forced to play A, B, and C because of this composition is optimal, obviously you don't know what is going to happen, but in theory you have more freedom of what you want to pick.
Exactly. I mean, like you said, we'll still have the rock, paper, scissors thing, but there will be like 3 rocks and maybe 4 scissors now, instead of just one comp that is better than all of the other comps.
Yeah, and much like you said, and I brought in the beginning of the conversation, I truly believe what we're going to see is people going to champions they like rather than specific compositions, because you can't afford to practice 2 compositions and then you get a ban and you're forced to improvise a composition mid-tournament, you know? Yeah. So players will have a broader pool and they will have more chances to express all these different champions that they like, being a signature or not.
Yeah, I think you're right. We'll have to see when season 2 of the BPL starts. It's going to be very interesting with these new rules implemented. Is there anything else you're hoping to see or think you will see from the bans that we haven't touched on already?
Well, from what I have been seeing, and I talked with players obviously to see how they are scrimming, for example, practicing against other teams and such. What has been happening so far is, like, the first ban is usually targeted at something they don't want to face, either because, like, it's a champion, it goes against their main strategies. Mm-hmm. Or it's a champion that it could even be a signature champion or a main champion for a one trick or something. And the second ban usually comes as a way to break the strategy your opponent is using. So let's say, for example, I know this is a very extreme example, but if they have Varesh and Ashka, they will always ban Paloma because they know Paloma does really well with those 2 champions. Yeah. So that's how initially things are happening, and I think it's what I expected from bans. But let's see how it develops right in season 2.
Do you think we'll see a lot of new compositions, like people throwing surprises in there and curveballs just because that third ban is going to make it harder for them to go for the comps that everybody already know?
I definitely think so. And I think they'll be forced to do so because, as we discussed, it will be hard for them to really put the compositions they want in place.
Yeah. All right, I'm very excited about bans, and it makes me even more excited than I already was for season 2. With that, I think I have gotten a lot of useful information to you out of the bans. I hope everyone who watches this video got a lot of useful information as well. If you got more questions, is there anywhere people can direct them if they want to ask more questions about the BPL in general?
I assume we're gonna create a Reddit topic with this. So if you guys have questions, suggestions, feedback, just write in the Reddit thread, and I'll make sure to reply. And also, you can always link my Twitter in the description, which is at Boccato, but the end is a 0 instead of a O.
I'll link that in the description of this video as well, of course. Is there anything you would like to say before we shut this thing down?
Yes, I think it's important to say that I don't expect bands to have 0 flaws, or that this was absolutely the right decision and there is no way we're going back to no bans or anything of that sort. I am always willing to discuss and hear different opinions. I'm sure even players themselves will have developed opinions, right, when the BPL season 2 is over. And I'm just open to feedback. So make sure to drop your questions and criticisms, and I'll make sure to take them in consideration for the future.
All right. I recommend everybody seeing this to take you up on that offer. Let them know what we think. All right. Thank you very much for talking to me, Boccato, and I hope we can do it again soon sometime.
Definitely. Let's do that more often.
Yeah, I agree. All right. Thanks for joining me. Bye-bye.
See ya.